The pull is getting stronger as we approach the womb of destruction, Asarnil declared as the two of them pored over a wide map on the table before them. Surrounding them, the 5 remaining lords of Charnak gazed at the map and at their king. The other 5 lords of Charnak had already broken off from the main fleet at this point, and on their independent paths to each Exodite world in their assigned division, each one commanding over one of the vessels they had first departed with. It's good that the younger lords had been sent off already. Otherwise, we would already be having casualties. One of the lords grunted behind a ceremonial war mask. He reached up to rub at his chin for a moment. Man, Prince, where's your next sibling godling again? Guilliman had since given up on getting the various lords to stop calling him and his siblings godlings. It was merely an exercise in frustration, speaking to blank stone walls as he had learned. Instead, he reached forwards and placed a marker on where he remembered the planet Cocus being. One of the lords, the one wearing a thick green mantle over their long cream robes, raised a hand and twisted it to the right. The map obliged by narrowing its field of view to only include the relevant regions. Guilliman himself obliged by looking at the map again, and then replacing the token on the creatively named Colchis sector. The lord with the green mantle curled 2 fingers, drawing a line between the planet and the Eye of Terror, which automatically generated a distance in Eldar numerals. The map zoomed out, and then compared this number to how far they were currently away. The end result was that they were about twice as far away from the Eye of Terror currently, compared to how close the planet was to the Eye of Terror. Eldar didn't mumble so much as they did twitch, mostly in the ears. It served as a quick visual indicator for how agitated they currently were. The rest of their body was typically completely still and silent. Judging from the few rapid flickers, there was quite a bit of agitation. The pull is lesser when near those relics, man Prince. But that will only shield the ship you're currently aboard. It cannot shield the rest of us from her call. One of the lords, this one wearing a vibrant orange cloak and mantle of feathers, spoke. I'm not sure we can approach that near without more effective wards. It's fortunate so few of our kin live on this side of the wheel. The lord with the green mantle commented. The only I can readily think of is Detha, and I imagine their world spirit is particularly besieged. They were almost adjacent to the womb as it broke. They still endured in your vision? Indeed, they wore a lot of white and red, Guilliman recalled, staring at the region in small amounts of frustration. It wasn't the most problematic issue to arise, but it was a notable one. If only one ship could approach, then it would be particularly vulnerable to attack. Ideally, he would have at least 3 ships for as long as possible, but that might not be prudent here. Remind me to plan for their evacuation if possible. I doubt that world is particularly pleasant to dwell upon. Flickers of agreement as the Eldar looked to the map. Guilliman was so very glad they didn't treat him with particular awe. If he had claimed he was going to evacuate an entire planet surrounded by humans of the 41st millennium, they would have broken out into hushed whispers and awestruck prayers. Evacuation was a routine task when conducted properly, and they usually treated it as a miracle. The aged voice of the oldest present lord spoke, the primary evidence of his incredible age being the deepened lines around his mouth and at the corners of his eyes. He was clad in heavy wraithbone plate, decorated in turquoise filigree, and wearing a thick cloak of the same shade. His hair was black, streaked through with white and gray, and it hung down to the middle of his chest. You'll need at least 2 ships. Retrofit. From Lian Song into a ghost dragon, we had little need of wraithlords presently. That can accompany Charnik's pride, without risk. The rest of us will fill into the other 3 ships and rejoin you at Athalak. You'll sacrifice your ship, Lord Cirrus? Asarnil asked for clarification. Lord Cirrus's ears did not flicker. I can get a new ship, Dragon Lord. It can be sacrificed to ensure your escape in the event of an attack this way, Only 5 souls will be swallowed instead of thousands. It was the sort of cold pragmatism of a veteran commander, the kind that weighed lives and materials on scales. Guilliman heard a foot squeaking slightly against the floor behind him. He furrowed his brows together, deliberately not looking behind him. Slowly, he closed his eyes and breathed in and out. Opening his eyes again, the looks on the faces of the assorted eldar lords did not change, but their slightly upturned ears and amused gleams told him exactly what he had suspected. He reached up to pinch the bridge of his nose for a moment before he called out loud, "I do hope there's no children misbehaving, possibly trying to sneak up on their older brother, who is busy in a very important meeting right now. I would be very sad if I knew that." Asarnil smirked. Cyrus's ear tips flickered. Slight shifts in the stances around him. 2 sets of footsteps slowly backed away before finally exiting the bridge entirely and running off. Little pitter-patters echoed through the ship as they fled the scene. Guilliman sighed and rubbed his forehead. "I apologize for that. They keep managing to slip away from their minders." "Bear no mind to it, man prince," Cirrus droned out, eyes cold but kind. "You're a godling. Siblings are one of the objectives of this voyage. I'm sure the younglings here can tolerate their mischief. Only younglings to you, withered root." The lord wearing the war mask jabbed back, a very blunt and unsubtle insult. This seemed more typical among their military and dragon knights who didn't indulge in the contests of wit as often. There was likely a joke to be made with that fact. Where were we? Asarnil interrupted the argument before it could begin, causing much twitching of ears, and resumed staring at the map on the table before them. They still had a route to revamp, and limits of mental endurance to test. "You have my deepest apologies, Slayer of Evil." Maid bowed low before him. "I was unable to keep them from the bridge. I shall request another to take my place if that is your wish." He raised a hand. "You have no need to apologize. I know how difficult it is to keep track of them. Simply continue with your best efforts, and I will be satisfied with that." The maid rose from her bow but kept her head low. He nodded at her, before stepping forwards into the room that served as the bedchambers of his sisters. Inside was a meticulously clean chamber, with soft, warm, cream-color walls and numerous rugs and blankets and fabrics, mostly of cloth and silk and animal pelts of various kinds. And on one of the 5 beds in the large chamber, his sisters sat together and deliberately didn't look at him, busying themselves with a large Eldar book. He raised a brow. They were playing innocent then? He leaned against the doorway and waited with a quirked mouth. Petra sent a glance his way, before quickly pretending to have not seen him. Cassandra, as Petra had declared her new sister would be named, sent her own glance his way, before flinching down and burying her head in the furs and quilts that served as blankets. It didn't sink in what it would mean to have retrieved his siblings so soon, that he would effectively be raising them for the next 5 to 10 years. He knew that on an intellectual level, of course, someone had to do it properly, and they had landed on atrocious planets. He had almost called in for a complete military takeover of Nostromo before remembering he didn't have his legions with him. A massively inefficient planet filled to the brim with a valuable resource. A resource that was being harvested and refined in some of the most offensively poor conditions he had ever personally seen. Even the cult Mechanicus and their habit of using corpse slaves would be preferable, because at least their labors would be maximally efficient given what they had to work with. The cult Mechanicus was many things Guilliman hated, and would become even more things he loathed, but they were absolutely effective when it came to the extraction of a planet's mineral wealth. Their great flaw was that they didn't usually leave a useful planet behind afterwards. And would it be so bad for a planet like Nostromo to cease existence? He wasn't seeing many moral arguments against erasing that dim ball of misery and suffering. Russ had many jokes made at Conrad's expense, mostly pointing towards his twitchy habits and apparently deluded ramblings. Guilliman had politely chuckled along at the time. He couldn't find it in himself to laugh anymore, not at that. Not after finding the tiny, starving, shivering thing that was his sister, mouth and hands stained in the gore of raw meat, body covered in cuts and bruises, crying over a loaf of bread. Guilliman thinks he might just hate Nostromo. His hands itched to write plans to fix it, even knowing that he had no time to waste on a planet so far away from his intended theater. It's so quiet in here. I wonder where my sisters could be, he said aloud in pretend confusion. I wanted to spend time with them, but I can't seem to find them anywhere. Petra continued to stare at the book, only to blink in shock as she realized Cassandra was no longer by her side, and instead power walking over to his position. She quickly threw herself from the bed and raced to follow. 2 very small primarchs crashed into his legs, one after another. He smiled and reached down, grabbing both by the back of their shirts and lifting them up to scramble onto his shoulders. They had fallen for his trap. He raised his hands to gently hold onto their legs, making sure they wouldn't fall off by accident, and ignoring how Cassandra lashed onto his head. He began to move, leaving the room and heading for the hangar. He was going to make them talk to the oldest wraith. So, he began after some time. Why'd you try to sneak up on me earlier? Petra poorly denied. Oh, so I heard some other tiny little sister footsteps during my very important meeting earlier? Yes. Petra was very bad at lying. Cassandra wasn't even trying to, and she was doing slightly better. Ah, I see. He gave a fake nod. I suppose I need to find and spend time with them instead. He swiveled on a dime and started taking them back towards their room. We did it, Cassandra blurted out. We did. Petra quickly agreed, also now latching onto his head. Their little hands began to pull and stretch his face. They were entirely too old for this. It had been a few months since retrieving Cassandra, and they had grown appropriately. Now they looked like they were 13 or so, with a human. Cassandra, of course, was substantially younger in terms of actual age. She had simply been forced to grow faster by her environment. By the time they returned to Charnik, Guilliman was certain they would be as tall as the Eldar were, and still have a few more years of growth in them. He was simply glad his planned curriculum was keeping up thus far. They were voracious learners. I told you two that it was important. Why did you try to sneak into it? He patiently asked them. His sisters fidgeted for a while, before eventually Cassandra answered. Wanted to see. Petra nodded against his head. Guilliman raised a brow. It was mostly boring technicalities and revisions. I can tell you after the meetings if you really want me to. Wanted to see you, Petra corrected. Guilliman sighed, letting his shoulders slump slightly. I was only going to be gone for a few hours. Every day, Cassandra muttered. Goodness, was he ever this clingy as a child? He recalled the streets of Nostromo, and felt guilt about having that thought. Instead, he nodded slowly and spoke gently. Yes, Cassandra, I have many duties to attend to. I can't be around at all times. That's why I want you to learn as much as possible from the tutors so that you can take care of yourselves while I'm away. There was no reply. He shook the two of them gently. Can you do this for me, please? Can you learn all you can so I don't worry for you? Okay, Petra replied. I'll make sure Cassandra learns too. Cassandra? Okay, she muttered. They were still in their clingy phase, he supposed. That would change as they got older. They were primarchs, after all, not normal humans. Soon enough, their instincts would start churning for leadership and war, something ingrained into all of them. They were tools of their father, after all, tools that had a humanity to protect. But not right now. The proper conquest could wait for when they got back to Charnak. On this voyage, at least, they could be children. They could simply have a childhood. Something Guilliman had received, and from what he had seen thus far, something few of his brothers had gotten. It was the least he could do if he wanted to be a better brother to them this time around. There were 4 distinct categories of war automata in terms of size. This was a very general scale, of course, as the galaxy was a very large place with many different races that produced such large-scale machines. For simplicity's sake, the Imperial planners often divided them into 4 broad categories and then narrowed the scope from there dependent on mission profiles. Certain scales were simply unusable for certain missions. You wouldn't send a giant of 30 meters to clear out a habitat block. You'd send it if you wanted that habitat block destroyed. The smallest scale was often referred to as plebeian. It was used to refer to any construct of roughly human scale. All constructs up to roughly 5 meters in height were in this category. Rarely seen outside of certain technological cults, these were usually replaced with menial labor or standard soldiers. The Wraith Guards of the Eldar were in this category. The second smallest scale was often referred to as armiger, High Gothic for squire, and based on the classification of war construct found on night worlds, the Imperial Knight, armiger, ranging from 6 to 12 meters in height, and often deployed alongside a large group of heavy infantry, or as part of a large group supporting a larger form of war construct. The dreadnoughts of the Adeptus Astartes were in this class of war construct as well, standing roughly 5.4 meters. The second largest, and one of the most common categories, was often referred to as equises, High Gothic for night, and referring to any construct of 12 to 45 meters in scale. This name, too, was based on a form of war construct found on night worlds, the Imperial Knight, and all its various makes and models. The Wraith Knight was technically not considered such, but as Eldar war constructs were often taller and thinner than human equivalents, it was classified as such for simplicity. The Wraith Knight sitting before him was a giant of 18 meters, plated in the same standard cream-white plating of normal wraithbone, decorated in curling vines and leaves of pure gold, and bearing a night-scale cloak of emerald green dragon hide and a massive mantle of dragon crest feathers. The center of its chest bore a massive spirit stone of a blood-red hue, and all across its body he could see prayers inscribed in Eldar runes faintly shimmering. A cloak that large, with no marks of being stitched together from multiple individuals, means that the dragon it came from must have been absurdly large in scale. Currently, the giant of mystic bone, controlled by a long-dead Eldar, was telling a story to his sisters. Its colossal wraithbone sword was resting by its side, and the segmented psychic shield projector on its left arm was folding in on itself and deactivated. It was in those days that a world named Uthumil was green, and its trees grew mighty branches, and its waters were blue and deep, as was good. Uthumil bore 3 mighty mountain ranges, and from these ranges a kind of large hunting bird would swoop down and peck at the eyes of those that dwelled in that place. This was not good. These birds were a kind of delicacy to the Eldar of the city Vol, Moraihig, for their meat was tender and sweet, but they were a vicious breed and spat lightning from their eyes. It was the style of the time for a man to declare his affections and prowess by hunting one of these birds and presenting the meal to his woman. This was a very fashionable thing to do. It became so that eventually such contests became so frequent that, Venerable Malwern, you were telling them about how the city of Camorra got its name. The Wraith speaker at the side of the massive Wraith Knight spoke up, reminding that ancient soul of what it was doing before its thinking started to slip off topic. In battle, a Wraith speaker was critical to ensure that the Wraiths were at fullest awareness. Outside of battle, it seemed that was still the case. Oh, I was, wasn't I? The Wraith Knight paused, raising its hand up to the large plate of smooth material that served as its effective chin. Its rumbling voice echoed through the large chamber as it pondered the idea. Eventually coming to a conclusion, the Wraith Knight started once more. So after winning the hand of the Princess of Vaslatai, The warrior who would eventually become known as Falinesh, but was currently known as Falwern, had to defend himself in 3 contests of skill, one of which involved taming a beast native to the world, Indald. Shash, known as the Tanzeltoff. The world of Indald Shash was Red Planet in those days, filled with warring life such as the Guilliman smiled as he worked through his next line of work. The Wraith Knight hadn't noticed that his audience, the 2 young primarchs, had fallen asleep a while ago, bored by the long-winded story that wasn't really going anywhere. He smiled and nodded at the Wraith speaker, who smiled and nodded in turn. It had been 3 years since they left Sharnak, and they were making tremendous progress. Slightly more than halfway finished with all planned tasks and duties, and soon to reach another major milestone. The problem was what that milestone was. Colchis, original homeworld of Lorgar, the Primarch most responsible for the Horus Heresy, and the ruination of the dream of a golden imperium. Perhaps not utopia, not with all the dangers of the galaxy at their doorsteps, but certainly better than all ages that came before, better than who they were the moment prior. Lorgar had woven a song of ruin, a series of schemes and actions that brought all that to rubble. A plan that turned the Primarchs on each other, that turned legions onto legions, and brought 10,000 years of suffering to the whole galaxy. It all came back to Lorgar and his blasted, cursed, heretical symphony. But it was likely that Lorgar would have never done such a thing were it not for Roboot Guilliman, the brother that obeyed the Emperor's orders to raise Monashia, capital of the planet Kerr and jewel of Lorgar's eyes, and force Lorgar to kneel. It's possible that Lorgar would have never acted to bring all things to destruction were it not for him. Of course, it's equally possible that the Emperor would have simply gotten another Primarch to humble their brother. But Guilliman did not live through that possibility. He lived through the possibility in which he had obeyed. He couldn't find it in himself to ever forgive Lorgar, but neither could he reasonably forgive himself. He, too, had a hand in their fall. He could not say that he was innocent in that. The guilt of that battle weighed on him like a heavy stone. This was a chance to change all that. Guilliman was grabbing it with both hands. Colchis was a massive, mostly barren world, 3.4 times larger than Terra, an amount of gravity that crushed down like an omnipresent judgment. It had a long, slow year of 4.8 Terran years, and an even longer, slower day of 170.4 Terran hours. It was a hot, dry, sunny world that bred very short, very stout, and very tanned humans. Colchis was a feudal world, filled with the scraps of a once technologically adequate civilization that has since vanished under the sands. What was left behind was nothing more than a great religious covenant that dominated the planet's centers of agriculture and life, and the occasional band of wandering nomads scraping out meager lives between the dunes and seas of a world that could barely sustain life. It was predicted by Imperial scholars that it would create a new variation of squats, given enough time. That didn't happen originally because Guilliman's Ultramarines had made sure to destroy it completely in 0110 and 31. It was a collapsed world by then, filled with collapsed industries and people barely clinging to life. He did not begrudge that decision at the time, and he didn't even now, because the moment they entered the same system as Colchis, the Emperor's sword set itself alight with hateful fire and was nudging his arm towards the planet. Asarnil and all other Eldar present had recoiled once they got close enough, and their dragons started to thrash in agitation. The planet reeked of chaos. It was an ever-present waft that Guilliman couldn't ignore. Indeed, he was baffled by the thought of the Emperor not feeling this crawling warp when he first came to Colchis to retrieve Lorgar. Then again, the forces of chaos had not revealed themselves yet. It was only his campaigns in the far future that made him so sensitive to its presence. It was possible that the Emperor had overlooked such senses blinded by the presence of Lorgar all those years ago. Your sibling is here. The eldest seer present had spoken, barely keeping his disgust for the planet out of his voice. They stand out as a golden candle in a sea of noxious pale. The only question is, how thoroughly do we destroy this place? Asarniel growled out, ears flickering in predatory intent. Guilliman could feel his own glare plastered to his face, even as he gently shook his head. It's not the objective here. Retrieving my sibling and leaving immediately is. The Emperor will be here soon enough and impose the imperial truth upon the world. Ideally, a more wholesome and efficacious cult would be established after 3 or so generations. Guilliman's mouth twisted down as he considered that. I suppose that might have been Lorgar's purpose. He didn't know what the Emperor intended for Lorgar, but if his purpose was to establish a cult that wouldn't feed chaos in the cleansing aftermath of the imperial truth, it fit with what he now knew of the nature of gods, but he couldn't be sure. The Emperor clearly didn't wish to be worshipped, especially if he would slave him to his eventual legend. But Guilliman had seen the corpse of his creator in all of its agonizing prominence. 10,000 years of suffering to hold back the night was not insubstantial. Regardless of his creator's faults, Guilliman would defend his dedication to humanity to his dying breath. That sight had burned that truth into his mind well enough. 10,000 years of pain. Guilliman wasn't confident that he could do the same. He was just going to ask some very pointed questions for his creator when they met again, such as why one of the primarchs was clearly meant to codify and optimize systems of belief when the Great Crusade was supposedly to rid the galaxy of their superstitions and obsolete faiths. And Lorgar was raised here, amongst worshippers of chaos. Their practices would taint the eventual new faith and simply feed chaos again, undoing the cleansing and forcing a new purgation. Asarniel continued the line of thought before shaking his head. A plot measured in the decades and woven from the very beginning. We best hope we have arrived before they sank their talons too deeply into your sibling, otherwise they'll simply be a trap waiting to be sprung. Indeed, Guilliman muttered. Same as Olympia, then? A sound decision. Asarniel agreed, but I refuse to let you enter this place alone. At least 100 in the initial arrival, and everyone else immediately ready to reinforce you. This could easily be another layer to the trap. Agreed. Guilliman muttered, turning to move towards the hangar bay. They would be over his sibling's current position soon enough. He would descend, and either come back with another sibling to raise, or pass a judgment for a crime that might not happen. He was ready for either, truthfully. He's had a long time to consider this. A ruined starship, half sunk into the sands and dunes around it, served as the home of an outcast sect of the wider faith of Colchis. It was over this ruined starship that 2 ships of bone and woven night sky descended, swimming through the dry air above as a pair of oasis lobsters. They approached closer and closer, rapidly filling more and more of the sky above the starship temple, until the long sun of Colchis itself was drowned out beneath their grand bulks. 2 armored leviathans, each 5 kilometers in length, gently circled the sky directly above, as sharks might surround an injured seal. Far sooner than it should, night had descended around the outcasts, leaving a single glaring pillar of light directly over their relatively small shelter. Guardians of this outcast faith emerged, carrying primitive weapons of steel and flintlock guns, dressed in robes of white and black, and shuddering with the sudden and unexpected sights overhead. Should the ships circling them decide to unleash payloads, they would have no way to survive, not with the destruction of one of their few shelters from the long sun destroyed. A great clamor and quiet panic was building among them, and among them murmurs of invaders, or worse. Deep within the ad hoc compound, a battered figure, curled in on herself and stained in unmentionable substances, slowly smiled. Golden eyes glowed in the darkness of the chamber, even through the throbbing pain throughout and within her flesh. The cargo hatch of one of the ships slowly opened, pulling itself apart like the mouth of some great beast, and the ships slowed their rotations for a moment. The defenders preemptively readied themselves for a destructive payload. A great blur fell from the open port in the ship, descending rapidly with the mountains in the distance framing its fall. A trail of fire followed behind it, and the sun glinted off a golden-blue body. It disappeared behind a dune, and then impacted the sands with a great upheaval of dust and winds and sound. But there was no explosion, no sudden rush of heat and death, just the sound of something extremely heavy crashing into the dry earth over the hill in front of their prepared defenses of stone and scrap. A crown of gold emerged over the dune before them, followed by a halo and winged ears and a mask of death. The figure in the distance slowly rose over the hill before standing at the top and staring down at the defenders. A shield of gold and a burning sword were clenched in its armored hands, and a long robe of purest white flowed in the eternal breeze of the desert. It stared at them for a time before it began to move once more, approaching their compound. "I am Malam Kaido." The figure boomed, voice rumbling over them as thunder and truth. "I am the son of the Emperor of Mankand. I seek my sibling, the Aurelian." The figure did not stop, even as half-hearted attempts to deter it with wide flintlock fire and brandished weapons were made by the defenders. Their morale quaked once more, when the very world cracked open behind the figure, and rows of white-clad warriors with tall helmets and bearing jeweled weapons stepped out. 100 in total, bearing cloaks of lizard hide and swords of bone, moved with perfect harmony. The figure stopped once it reached the gates of their compound, and slowly turned its armored helm to the closest guardian. "Open the gate." The figure rumbled an order. The guardian, jittering with nerves, dropped his weapon and raced to comply. The other guardians, shaken by the appearance of 100 warriors, did nothing to stop this. The rusted gates to their compound opened, and the figure strode into their receiving chamber without resistance. As he did so, another figure emerged from the doorway, leading deeper into the compound. An older man, with a heavy brow and a gaunt face, attempted to smile at him. Guilliman knew this face as Cor Ferron, the adoptive father of Lorgar. He recognized it well enough. It was the face that was among the soldiers of the Word-Bearer's Legion. "Ah, an angel from the Empyrean. My lord, our humble house was not expecting your visitation." The man attempted to flatter him. Unfortunately for his efforts, Guilliman had absolutely no interest in staying on his planet any longer than he absolutely had to. "My sibling, they landed on this planet. Growing rapidly, learning quickly, and with superhuman body. I have come to bring them home. You will present them to me now." He rumbled out, staring down the man through his skull helm and shifting his burning blade to emphasize his demand. "Ah, yes, of course, my lord. But she has just finished her assigned chores and should be made presentable first. Allow us time for her to bathe and—" Guilliman raised his sword in one rapid moment and brought it close enough for the man to feel the heat of the psychic flames dancing upon it. The shadows of the chamber recoiled in pain from its light. He staggered back and away from the blade, suddenly filling his view. "Her state is irrelevant. She will be here as soon as possible." He stated his demands quite clearly, leaving his threat unspoken. There was no need to say his intentions aloud. "Of course, Lord Angel," the priest muttered out, fear filling his voice. Guilliman found that he quite loathed that title. He waved a hand to an attending servant, who looked like they were quite glad for the opportunity to flee the vicinity. Cor Ferron swallowed his saliva and turned back to Guilliman, attempting a charming smile and opening his mouth to speak again. "You will speak when you are addressed." Guilliman interrupted him, fixing his skull helmet directly at the priest. The priest shuddered for a moment, before wisely keeping his mouth shut. Guilliman began to count down 1 minute with the intention to start killing priests once he reached 0. He had absolutely no desire to be on this planet any longer than he had to. Unfortunately, he only reached 12 when 2 figures emerged from one of the side paths. One was the guard, who was very careful to not look at him, and the other was what could only be his sister. Another sister, which reinforced the theory that Guilliman stared at her, narrowing his eyes and evaluating. Short hair of pure white, roughly cropped. Eyes that faintly glowed gold in the dim light of the ruined ship interior. Clad in bulky and concealing brown robes of rough and poor make, she stood nearly 7 feet tall. That spoke of particularly harsh conditions, assuming she landed immediately after the scattering, which he knew wasn't true originally. He stood still as she stepped forwards. She stumbled once and quickly righted herself. Clasping her hands in a prayer-like fashion, she attempted to bow in a proper manner towards him. She stumbled forwards again. Dropping his shield, he caught her. She was thin. He could feel it through her robes. She smelled of something noxious. His face went blank behind his helm. He recognized the stench. She tried to speak. He cut her off with a question. "How old are you?" he demanded. She smiled at him and replied, "By Colchian count, this is my 31st day." He almost flinched at her voice. It sounded relieved, desperate. His mind automatically converted the sum into Terran standard. 7 months, 10 days. She was nearing 7 feet tall. His sword almost shook as he raised it and let it flare once. The shadows screamed as they fled from it, and the psychic signal alerted the eldar on board Charnok's Pride. A webway gate crashed into existence next to him. He locked gazes with the seers in the back. They recoiled, before one nodded and approached. A squad of soldiers appeared at the edge of the gate, and he nodded at them. Turning his gaze back to his sister, he spoke in a gentle tone. "Go with them. I will follow soon, sister." She shakily rose from his arm and smiled. "Brother," she whispered before falling into the gate. The seer emerged from it, and the gate closed behind them. Guilliman rose to his full height once more, turning his gaze to Cor Ferran, frozen in place by the psychic power of the seer next to him. Guilliman stepped forwards to loom over the priest, before speaking calmly. "There is a safety mechanism in the genes of my siblings. It accelerates our growth in response to a hostile environment." Cor Ferran swallowed, but was unable to move. He attempted to speak. "Then your sister, dear Aurelia, was truly a gifted child. I took 10 years to reach adulthood. She is 7 Terran months old." His rage was buried under a titanic will. "What did you do to my sister?" His voice was carefully calm. The sword of the Emperor burned gold, heating the steel floor of the ship beneath it to dangerous temperatures. He opened his mouth. Guilliman cut him off. "Ryu, seer, rip everything from his mind." The seer promptly obliged. Minutes of screaming ensued. All guards and servants who approached were deterred by the titanic heat of the blade he held. Finally, the priest slumped back in pain and exhaustion, and the seer swayed momentarily. Guilliman reached out a hand, stabilizing them, before commanding, "Don't speak. Show me." The seer hesitated before complying with his demand. Guilliman saw all Cor Ferran had done to his sister, which he now knew the name of, Aurelia. He stood in place for a long moment, processing every scene that flashed before his eyes. Eventually, he spoke. His gaze focused on the priest attempting to stagger up and crawl away. "Seer, return to the ship. Tell Asarnil that this planet burns." The seer vanished through a webway gate immediately, sensing his black mood. His red gauntlet vibrated with a boundless fury. His hands shook with a rage he could not contain, so he did not The sword of the Emperor came down before Guilliman. His rage fueled the psychic flames that wreathed the blade. The air burned as it flashed before him. Death came down upon the fearful priest of chaos. Death came down upon the walls and floors behind him. Death came down upon all living things that stood before him. A wave of golden fire turned the world before him into ash and slag. A cone stretching hundreds of feet before him was turned into molten metals and fresh glass. Waves of golden wrath turned everything to cinder, material or immaterial. Not even their souls were spared. The first of 10,000 swings of his sword. Guilliman turned his head. His red arm flashed. Another wave of all-consuming flame issued forth. Then another. Then another. Then another. Then another. A giant of bone fell from the heavens, crashing into the sands, its scale on par with towers and dragons, not with any living man. Reality shattered around the burning pit, and thousands of white-clad soldiers stepped forth, carrying swords and psychic fires of their own. Guilliman reclaimed the shield of his father. A dreadful calm settled over his mind as the task of extermination ossified. He turned his gaze in the direction of the next city, his sword tugging his arm in that direction. He began to move. The warriors of the Eldar moved with him. The giant of bone began to rumble with ancient poems of war and death. The ships above began to move with dreadful intent, weaving as colossal predators among defenseless prey. The scouring of Colchis had begun.